In the 90s, between neon lights and noisy cabinets, a game was born destined to change forever the way video games portray violence. Mortal Kombat is not just a fighting game. It is a language, a ritual, a cultural phenomenon that has crossed arcades, home consoles, and even the halls of the American Senate. In this episode of POST-LUDENS, we analyze what is really behind that digital blood. Not just extreme aesthetics, but a system built to transform violence into a show, a ritual, and a product. Mortal Kombat was born in the early 1993 in the Midway Game Studios, under the direction of Ed Boon and John Tobias, in a context still dominated by American arcade culture. Arcades, multiplex cinemas, and shopping malls still represented places of aggregation where the video game was a public spectacle, direct competition, and immediate entertainment. In this environment, a headline needed to strike quickly, be readable, accessible, and visually distinctive. Mortal Kombat responded perfectly to these needs, introducing an unprecedented aesthetic for the time based on the digitization of real actors and a simple, fast, and brutal combat system. But above all, it was the explicit representation of violence that ultimately made it a cultural phenomenon. Blood splatters, dismemberments, and above all, the famous fatalities. Final executions that transformed the victory into a deliberately shocking spectacle. The move to home consoles further amplified the impact of the title. The versions for Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis mark an obvious rift. Nintendo opted for a heavily censored and reduced version, while Sega distributed a version more faithful to the arcade original, accompanied by an aggressive advertising campaign aimed at a young audience. This choice helped fuel a heated public debate in the United States, culminating in the Senate hearings on violent content in video games, and subsequently in the creation of a system of self-regulation of the industry. In this sense, Mortal Kombat is not only a successful video game but a turning point, the moment in which the video game medium definitively enters the contemporary cultural and political discourse, transforming violence from a simple aesthetic element to a media and commercial hook. On the front of game design approach to fighting games, we see rather stark contrast between two design philosophies that in the 90s coexist in the same arcade space, but respond to almost opposite logics. On the one hand, the technical abstraction and the Japanese systemic depth, which almost totally dominated both the arcade and console space. On the other, the spectacular and almost fair immediacy of the American model embodied by the underdog American software company Midway. When Ed Boon and John Tobias begin developing Mortal Kombat at Midway Games, the context is already dominated by a very precise paradigm, defined by Street Fighter II. Capcom's title is not just a commercial success, it is a grammar. It introduces a framework made up of sprites, frame data, move prioritization, zoning, space management, and a technical depth that rewards progressive learning and mastery of the mechanics. It is a game that requires discipline and gives back longevity. Midway deliberately chooses another path. It does not attempt to compete on the same level of complexity, but operates a systemic subtraction to gain immediate accessibility. Mortal Kombat's mechanics are stiffer, less fluid, with digitized animations that sacrifice frame readability in favor of visual impact. The fights are shorter, more cut, less built on space control, and more on direct and punishing sequences. In contemporary terms, it is a design that reduces the skill floor to drastically lower the entry difficult threshold for new players. This choice is not a technical limitation, but a strategic decision. The goal is not to hold the experienced player for hours, but to capture immediate attention in the arcade context, where every game is a coin and every second has to justify the expense. Mortal Kombat thus becomes a device of attraction. Sound, violence, realistic aesthetics, everything contributes to creating an effect of rupture with respect to the rest of the room. If you look at the contemporary landscape, the contrast becomes even more evident. SNK, with Fatal Fury and later with the King of Fighters, works on systems that expand strategic depth, introducing teams, resource management, and increasing complexity of moves. Sega, with Virtua Fighter, even inaugurates a new dimension, bringing combat in 3D and completely redefining the concept of space and timing. In all these cases, the direction is clear: increase combat simulation, even at the cost of making the system less accessible. Midway, on the other hand, does not simulate. It stages. The difference is substantial. Mortal Kombat's special moves aren't as difficult to execute as Street Fighter's, but they're built to be remembered, almost like ritual sequences. This becomes explicit with the introduction of fatalities, which represent a meta-combat mechanic. They are not used to win, but to conclude. They are not part of the competitive system, but of its spectacle. In this sense, Mortal Kombat introduces a second layer of engagement that other fighting games have not yet formalized: the secret. Fatalities, along with hidden moves and secret characters, create an ecosystem of shared knowledge that spreads orally in arcades and magazines. It is not just skill, it is information. The player is not only rewarded for how he plays, but for what he knows. This hybrid structure, simple in combat, opaque in discovery, allows Mortal Kombat to occupy a unique space in the arcade market. It is not the most technical game, nor the most balanced, but it is the one that generates the most conversation, the most shock, the most curiosity. It is, in almost advertising terms, a product perfectly designed to be seen even before being played. And while Japanese titles build increasingly refined and closed systems, Mortal Kombat remains deliberately dirty, incomplete, almost naive in its structure. I remember that when I was a kid, this game felt almost illegal to play. But it is precisely this imperfection that makes it permeable, a game that does not end in the cabinet, but continues to live outside in discussions, myths, and exaggerations. And it is here that his design logic is closer to a cultural phenomenon than to a simple playable system.
A less discussed aspect, but directly observable in the arcade rooms of the time, is that Mortal Kombat managed to attract a surprisingly transversal audience. Despite its explicitly violent aesthetic, it was one of the few fighting games to catalyze the attention of female gamers as well, to an extent more comparable to genres such as shooters, driving games, or dance simulators, rather than to Japanese-style technical fighting games. The plausible explanation lies not in a greater acceptance of violence, but in the nature of the show. Mortal Kombat is immediately readable, theatrical, almost performative. It requires less initial investment to be visually understood and returns strong and quick feedback, even to those unfamiliar with the technical language of the genre. In other words, even before being a competitive system, it works as a public attraction, and this lowers a barrier to entry that in titles like Street Fighter II remains more marked.
Violence in Mortal Kombat is not a simple aesthetic layer added to a combat system. It is the structure that makes it recognizable, its primary language. To understand this step, we need to go back to a direct precedent arcade game, also by Midway, Narc. In Narc, violence is already a spectacle, but in a still crude form: exploding enemies, bodies that disintegrate in a deliberately excessive, almost slapstick way. There is no realism, there is exaggeration. It is a violence that does not ask to be believed, but just looked at. It is shocking to be entertaining, like those famous 80s action movies, but mixed with splatter elements and a photographic rendering of the textures, considered realistic for the time. The attitude of Midway is definitely punk and provocative, and precedes and contributes to the creation of the extreme culture of the 90s. Mortal Kombat inherits this setting and refines it. The digitized sprites introduce an appearance of realism, but the logic remains the same: amplification, deformation, provocation. The blood is too red and too much. The dismemberments too clear. The reactions too theatrical. It is a caricatured violence disguised as realism, perfectly aligned with the extreme aesthetic of the era. In this sense, the game does not simulate the human body. It uses it as a surface on which to engrave strong visual signs, immediately readable even by a casual spectator. The breaking point is therefore not in the amount of violence, but in its function. In contemporary fighting games, think Street Fighter II or SNK titles, the conclusion of the match is a technical fact. Loss of energy, KO, passage to the next round. In Mortal Kombat, however, victory is not complete until it is staged. Fatality intervenes exactly here. Fatality is not a useful move. It is not useful to win. It comes later. And it is precisely this after that defines its nature. It is a public execution, a coded gesture that requires a precise sequence of inputs, then memory, then knowledge. It is not improvisation. It is ritual. The game temporarily suspends the competitive logic and opens a performative space in which the winner stages his superiority in front of an implicit audience, the opponent, the spectators around the cabinet, and by extension, the community that knows and recognizes that sequence. In anthropological terms, the structure is surprisingly archaic. Arena, duel, binary outcome, and finally symbolic sacrifice. The fatality functions as a digital formalization of this structure. It does not simply represent violence. It organizes it in a legible, repeatable, and recognizable act. It's a grammar. Here, the distinction with the modern chapters of the series becomes clear. In contemporary modern Mortal Kombat games, violence changes visual status. It becomes hyper-realistic, anatomically detailed, almost surgical. Fatalities are no longer caricatures, but extremely precise simulations of the destruction of the human body. However, this escalation of detail comes into tension with another element that has developed in the meantime: an articulated narrative, characters with motivations, relationships, evolutionary arcs. The result is an obvious ludodissonance. The more the game world seeks narrative coherence, the more ritualized violence appears as an interruption, a moment in which the system stops telling and returns to exhibit. In the first arcade chapters, this fracture did not exist, because there was nothing to preserve. The context was minimal, almost pretextual. Violence could be gratuitous precisely because it did not conflict with any narrative depth. Midway does not limit itself to representing violence, but abstracts it, codifies it, and transforms it into a saleable language. Fatality is its hallmark, a semantic unit that immediately communicates identity, transgression, and reward. It is short, memorable, shareable. It works inside the game, but above all outside, in conversations, in magazines, in word of mouth, in marketing. In this sense, violence in Mortal Kombat is not content, but interface. It does not describe a world. It builds an experience of vision and participation. And precisely because it is ritualized, it can be repeated endlessly without losing its function. Like any ritual, it does not evolve by internal necessity, but by superficial variation, new animations, new visual details, keeping its structure intact. Victory, exhibition, celebration, even at the cost of its internal diegetic.
A further element clarifies why this structure has had such a strong impact: the implicit narrative context. Mortal Kombat builds an arena that is only loosely connected to reality. Temples, alternate dimensions, warriors who mix archetypes, ninjas, demons, soldiers, martial Hollywood stars make up an exotic and suspended space in which ordinary rules do not apply. It is not simply fantasy, it is a liminal zone. From an anthropological point of view, this can be read as a classic ritual space, separated from everyday life, where rules and prohibitions are temporarily suspended to allow a codified act that would be unacceptable elsewhere. The arena of Mortal Kombat works exactly like this. It delimits a symbolic perimeter in which violence is not only allowed, but required. Here a decisive detail intervenes: the voiceover. The command "finish him" is not a suggestion, but an injunction. It does not describe what is happening, it prescribes it. It transforms the player from a simple participant to a performer of a ritual. The technical victory is not enough. It must be completed through a final act that has symbolic and performative value. This passage is probably what generated the most friction with public opinion at the time. Not so much the presence of violence, already widespread predominantly in other media of the time, as its formalization as an explicit command, directed at the player. The game doesn't just show, it commands violence. and it is precisely here that its effectiveness on the younger audience is grafted. The injunction breaks the distance between spectator and action, creating an active complicity. In ritual terms, it is the equivalent of an officiant guiding the participant. The gesture is no longer optional, but an integral part of the sequence. Symbolic murder thus becomes the final act necessary to re-establish the internal order of the system of the tournament, a law of the strongest which, precisely because it is confined to a separate and codified space, can be consumed as a spectacle without direct consequences in the real world. In summary, "Finish him" is not just an iconic line. It is the point at which the language of the game becomes imperative, and the ritual is carried out. From competition, we move on to celebration, and from celebration to codification of a violence that no longer needs to justify itself, because it has already been inscribed in the rules of its world.
To deepen the discussion, let's shift our analysis from the content to the cultural structure that makes it possible. Mortal Kombat is not just a violent game, it is a system that organizes, transmits, and stabilizes violence as a form. Using the analysis tools already put in place in our previous videos, the first lens we can use is that of the philosopher and essayist Johann Huizinga in his Homo Ludens. His concept of the magic circle describes the ritual of game as a separate, delimited space in which autonomous rules apply. Within this space, actions that are normally forbidden become acceptable because they are inscribed in a shared symbolic system. Mortal Kombat operates exactly within this perimeter. Violence is not transgression, but rule. It is expected, codified, expected. Fatality does not break the system, it completes it. If we then apply the lens of Richard Dawkins with his theory of memes that is very relevant today, expressed in his popular book The Selfish Gene, the next step becomes evident. Fatalities work as memes in the strictest and most recognizable sense of the term. Cultural units capable of replicating themselves. They are easy to recognize because they are visually extreme. Replicable because they are linked to precise input sequences. Shareable because they can be transmitted orally or through the media. Memorable because they are built to impress. They are not just game content, but vectors of dissemination. They circulate among players, magazines, stories, creating a cultural ecosystem that goes beyond the cabinet. They survive as the most memorable ones are even carried over to later titles in the series. At this point, violence stops being an act and becomes a sign. Here, the reference is to structuralism, from the philosopher Michel Foucault to a broader conception of language as a self-replicating system. The fatality does not communicate killing in a realistic sense, but a codified message. I won. Look, remember. It is a gesture that exists because it is recognized. Its significance does not derive from its brutality, but from its position within a shared system of signs. In this sense, the violence of Mortal Kombat is already abstract, even when it appears visceral. It doesn't matter how graphic it is, what matters is its communicative function. Each fatality is a short, repeatable sentence, inserted in a precise grammar. The player is not simply performing an action, but uttering a statement about violence. Since we are always talking about video games after all, the natural closure of this path is in the postmodernist philosopher Jean Baudrillard. According to him, in a logic of hyperreality, the distinction between reality and representation loses consistency. Mortal Kombat, for example, does not simulate real violence, nor does it limit itself to representing it. It replaces it with a more readable, more codified, more consumable version. Fatality is clearer than any real act because it is designed to be seen, understood, and remembered immediately. The video game as a mechanism of representation operates a simulation of reality that is both simplified and expanded, in which the essential elements are given a marked cognitive presence. Here, the violence is no longer real, but it is not mere fiction either. It has become a symbol, a language, a show, a product, a form of codified cultural game that feeds on itself. It exists because it is recognized, and it is recognized because it continues to be repeated. Mortal Kombat, in this perspective, is not only a notable case of extreme aesthetics, but a precise example of how even the most primitive element, violence, can be transformed into a stable, transmissible system of signs that is perfectly integrated into the logic of contemporary culture. A final note is about the way in which the American industry has metabolized the scandal of Mortal Kombat depiction of violence. Following the controversy generated by the game in 1994, the Entertainment Software Rating Board was born. Originally proposed by Sega and then signed by all major manufacturers like Nintendo, Atari, and Sony, formalizing a system of self-regulation that, at least in appearance, has the function of containing and classifying violence and guide parents with informed purchase. In practice, it also introduces a new level of commercial codification. Violence is not limited, but labeled, segmented, and made more precisely saleable and appealable. From that moment, the rating becomes part of the marketing language. The mature brand is not just a warning, but an identity signal aimed at a specific audience. Titles such as Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, Quake 3 Arena, The Grid, Carmageddon, and Duke Nukem 3D consolidate an extreme grammar that does not arise spontaneously, but is progressively refined and exploited at a corporate level. Transgression becomes predictable, reproducible, scalable. In this sense, the system of self-regulation does not repress violence, but definitively transforms it into a product. It makes it readable for the market, classifiable for the consumer, and therefore optimizable. It is a passage fully consistent with Jean Baudrillard's reading. What is born as a shock or rupture is quickly absorbed, recoded, and reinserted into the simulation circuit. Violence is no longer a limit to be overcome, but a variable to be calibrated. And as such, it can be modulated, amplified, or replaced according to the cultural needs of the moment.
Today, with a much more cynical and sales-oriented approach compared to that of the original creators of Mortal Kombat, AAA video games constitute the much more corporate and industrial conception of video games, the absolute least artisanal method in the way of conceiving this media. Yesterday with the 90s extreme in marketing, and today with other forms of symbolic, mechanical, or systemic signaling, such as aseptic and surgical violence, free sadism, microtransactions, gambling, infinite game cycle, and AI filtering. Ultimately, the first Mortal Kombat trilogy constitutes an archaic era of this language, which immediately led to enormous changes in industry and marketing, all subsequently instrumentalized to transform the medium and its rituals into nothing more than a shelf product.
The first Mortal Kombat games didn't portray violence in a realistic manner. They made it readable, repeatable, playable, and precisely for this reason, incredibly effective. Marketing has been able to package and distribute this new product, exploiting perhaps an ancestral cognitive prerogative present in human beings, that of simulation, with a dimension of play and fiction, of ritual violence. In this video, we have taken a great panoramic tour of the subject of violence in video games. Surely you are able to see and intuit interesting consequences of what we have said. And maybe you realize that some emerging elements are also a bit worrying, but we will certainly have the opportunity to deepen all this in the next videos. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. Leave a comment on what you found interesting or unclear. Every opinion is useful. Thank you, and see you soon.
This video was released in the net with the consent and supervision of the Autocratic Body for Information and Public Opinion in the year 2018. We hope to have entertained you and made you a little interested in what's behind the veil of old interactive media. See you again in the next episode. Bye bye.